Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. For those who have a Memorial Day holiday coming up or other holiday on Monday, hopefully you're getting ready for a long weekend. At FPF, we give off a day a month just because people are zoomed out. We started doing it, I think, after the George Floyd death. We had a lot of employees who wanted to either protest or rally or just were really feeling strained, and we continue to do it. So, of course, people chose today as our long weekend off. So I should be off, but this is fun. This is not work. Getting to chat with Daniel Solove is not work in any way. So thanks for those of you who are either vacationing as you watch this or are at your desks. Does he need an introduction? Well, no, but it's perhaps appropriate to point out to maybe some of you somewhere in the world who aren't aware of Professor Daniel Solove at the George Washington University School of Law, the founder of Teach Privacy, which provides privacy training, privacy videos, privacy education to individuals, to companies. Take a look at that if it is a relevant resource for you. But in addition to being a great educator and teacher, many of you know that Dan's scholarship, his books, his law reviews are among the most cited, and many are the core building blocks of privacy thinking and privacy data protection around the world. So I was a little surprised because I usually expect books, law reviews, tomes, weighty stuff, when Dan's latest book was a children's book. Now, I shouldn't have been surprised because I do know that he's I would say brand new father, but a relatively new father. And so probably had a bit more in his mind about how to talk about privacy, not to lawmakers and law reviews and CPOs, but to that youngest generation. Dan, I think I'm right? Was this sort of a gift to your? I mean, you've worried about teaching privacy in schools and universities for a long time, frankly, and FERPA and that sort of thing. But was this was this driven by your relatively new fatherhood?
Yes. My son is 10, but the project actually started many years
the other day, and he was just born the other day. It's 10 years.
I know, it's shocking.
Wow.
I'm still trying to catch up. But yeah, this was actually, the idea was born many years ago. I would have story time with my son at bedtime and create stories often with him. And he was a character in a lot of these stories, and ultimately is a character in this book. And the reason for creating the book was I encountered with a lot of children's literature looking for books for my son, and I wanted to find something that talked about the issue I work with. And there really wasn't anything. There really weren't books on this topic. And just generally, there aren't a lot of books on any kind of digital literacy topics on the fictional side for children that really brought these issues to life. And so I really wanted to bring this issue in a concrete, vivid way to life for children to understand what privacy is all about.
Now, did he provide any input when you were doing this? Did you share any of the the storyline and that sort of thing, or did he end up just reading it at the end as a finished product?
This one he read at the end. So in other stories, he would put a lot of input. He's actually a very prolific writer. He now writes 30, 40 typed page books constantly. I mean, he writes more stuff than I can write in a week. But at the time that this one in particular was created, this was really a kind of burst of inspiration that I had in an afternoon, and I wrote this, and I shared it with him, and I built it a lot on what his likes are. So I kind of learned over the years what he likes in a story and doesn't like in a story. So he's definitely a big influence on it. But this particular one, he wasn't in the author's seat.
Now, I confess it's a little bit scary. He obviously is a kid who can, who likes a good monster or sort of a scary sort of thing. He, that gets his attention. I probably might not read it to the youngest of children, but do you have a recommended ages for people who are listening, if they're going to get this for a gift or a friend, or what's the recommended age range?
Well, I would say the sweet spot is 6 to 9, and I would say it can go to 4 to 11. Depends on the younger children. I tend to think that, we have Where the Wild Things Are and other books that have creatures in them that are not the most vicious creature, and the main character is actually not like a mean person. He's just an overzealous thing, and he kind of looks like a cross between a horse and an alligator of some sort. So I realize there's definitely it definitely has a kind of a gothic feel to it, but I think that for younger children, I think they can often handle things that are a little on the creepy side, and that ultimately was the part of the point. One of the problems with surveillance is that it is creepy and it does make people uncomfortable. It isn't something that is it's unsettling, and that experience should, I think, be conveyed in the book. It's one of the things that makes surveillance disruptive of people's activities.
In some ways, the thought of privacy for younger children is a really difficult one, right? Because they certainly don't, we teach them about their private parts and physical privacy, but they certainly don't have a lot of privacy in their lives, their parents, and maybe they're scared of strangers and that sort of thing. But, the assumption that your parent will, be in your room and, look at your stuff and know even what you're doing, online. And we certainly see a policy trend to ask for parental consent, not only up to 12 or 13, but 14, 15, 16. There's a new proposal by Senator Markey to extend COPPA type protections, looking to have consent. Although in the Markey bill, what's interesting is that the teen can provide the consent to sharing information, which I wonder what that actually achieves. I mean, I guess it flips it to an opt-in rather than an opt-out or, no choice standard, the way, many of the other bills do. So that's helpful. But it certainly seems in Europe, where consent is obviously not always required under GDPR. I always get annoyed when people say GDPR requires consent, but when GDPR requires consent for children, which it does sometimes, it seems like it's very much a parental decision about what site you can give data to, and raises perhaps some concerns about maybe an older teen shouldn't have to tell their parent that they're reading about gay rights or something that that parent may not want the child exploring. So, I mean, how do you think about this notion of privacy for that younger teen audience, where we're sort of saying, yeah, you deserve some privacy, but by the way, we're going to be on top of you to make sure that you don't go to sites we don't want you to go to, or interact with strangers without your family member intermediating?
Yeah, it's a very difficult balance, and it's very contextual because, obviously, for younger kids and even, pre-teen kids, it's there are some times where they should have some privacy. But on the other hand, there are times where parents should be watching and should be looking over and monitoring what they're doing, because there are a lot of dangers and risks. And then there's also surveillance from others, as they surf the internet, as they play online games, there are folks that watch them or could be watching them, companies that are tracking what they're doing, gathering information, and so on. And they need to be aware that that's going on, that they're not in a purely private moment when they're surfing online. I think there's a lot of things they need to be aware of. Obviously, I think that there's a balance, because I think parental surveillance of younger kids is important. I mean, I certainly watched over what my son does and still do. He's increasingly wants more independence there. I think he certainly values privacy greatly now. And because it basically interfere. I interfere with his thing, because we have our lights on a system, and I can control him in my phone, and I can see when his lights in his room are on, when he's not sleeping and he's trying to sneak the reading. I can turn off his lights, and he's not happy with that. If he can find a way around it, which I'm sure he will at some point, he's going to do that.
Sounds like he doesn't yet have a cell phone.
He does not, no.
That's the big parental question, isn't it? I know that was our stress question, because once that happens, boy, you lose a lot of control over what your child does, even if you take it away, or the parental controls on the phones are still fairly rudimentary, and certainly reading. I love that my kids read on their phones. They buy books and they read, but I also know that they're up all night, and they're older now, so they're up all night and sleep all day. They become bats and nocturnal creatures at some point. Beware. What has that struggle started happening in your broader? When their friends have it, it's just so hard to say no.
Well, devices especially, we really tried to keep him off of a lot of devices, but it's very hard, especially with the pandemic. This is a way that he can interact with other children, and it's typically through online, or it's through playing Minecraft or other games. So he plays a lot more than what we would like, and he certainly knows his way around devices. I mean, he can figure out all sorts of things, and has you look at the computer, and he has at least 20 windows open, and I don't know how many Google accounts, and it's out of control. I think they really take to devices. It's very, very hard to keep them away. It's a constant struggle. But we try to keep it at bay to the best we can, because devices have good effects, but also bad effects too. And it's a balance with privacy too. That privacy is not the thing to be valued over all others. It's a value among many. It's a balance with a lot of things, and that's what makes it so hard for managing this with children. There are times where you want them to get parental consent, but there are other times where you don't. So an easy one-size-fits-all rule doesn't really work very well. And then figuring out how you get the law to address a lot of different nuanced contexts becomes really hard, which is, I think, one of the hardest things in privacy law. But the challenge of privacy law that really I find so interesting is, bright line rules don't work well in this field. It's really hard to come up with an easy rule. Opt-in for everybody under whatever age, or parental consent for everyone under 16. That doesn't work in all situations, but it does work in some. It is the best rule for certain types of instances, but not all. But then how do you create a law that's going to figure out when the answer is yes and when the answer is no?
And librarians, as you know, are sometimes the biggest privacy advocates, really fighting against government intrusion into knowing what people take out in terms of books. I would imagine the librarians of the world would be really interested in having a book like this to recommend to the younger audiences. Has it been on the radar screen of the kind of American Library Association, or the folks that are thinking about kids' literature and that sort of thing?
It has. I mean, I tried to find a publisher for it, and I think they just were kind of confused was the feedback I got. They don't have there's no category. If you go into the children's book section of Amazon and you try to categorize the book, look for privacy. You can't find it. You can't really find anything about the values that are privacy and security and other values for the digital age. It's really hard to actually put the book in any kind of field or genre, and so that's part of it. And they didn't know what to make of it. So when I sent that, they were not clear, what to do with this book. Quite honestly, is what I think the result was. So as a result, I had a really tough time finding a home for the book, and then just decided, what, I'm going to just go it myself. If no publisher is really going to believe in the project, I'd still like to get it out there. So one of the challenges with self-publishing is the amount of visibility that you can get, to get to the attention of the libraries, to kind of get the book out there is a lot harder without a big press behind you. So I hope that it will over time, get to their attention. But at least initially, it's been, I think it's been a good launch, but mainly a launch in the circle of people that I know.
Charlene Kuhn in the comments says that the NCPTF might be interested. The National Child Protection Task Force. That's a network of law enforcement and technology professionals that provide law enforcement agencies a rapid response team and investigative support. Well, Dr. Kuhn, if you have a link up to anyone there, I'm sure Dan would be more than happy to point them, or please do point them directly, and perhaps there is a match to be made. Anyway, folks, if you haven't gotten it, and if you don't have little kids, you need it too. My kids are teens. They're reading fantasy horror stuff. I can't get them to read this, but my wife loved it and I loved it. And if you're a data protection or privacy professional, how do you not have something like this on your shelf? It's like you have a book about fine art, or I have a history of wine, and I consider this a equivalent important production of our time for people in our sector. So whether you have kids or not, please check it out. Dan promised he'd also chat with me for a couple of minutes about a paper, a publication perhaps a little bit more suited for the older audience among us, the data protection geeks among us. And that's a recent paper several months ago, I guess already, that he published with his friend and colleague and our fan, the wonderful Danielle Citrin, labeled Privacy Harms. And for those who haven't read it, Dan, give a little bit of a picture of what you were looking to do here in helping us better understand what might be labeled a privacy harm.
Yeah, this is a project I actually started with Danielle like at least could be well more than a decade ago. We were talking about the need to better conceptualize privacy harms. And then we ultimately, finally, after talking about this forever, started and then decided that as we were writing, that data security harms, data breach in particular harms, were different in a lot of ways from the privacy harms. So trying to cover them both in the same article was going to be really hard. So we spun off an article on the data breach harms called Risk and Anxiety, and we published that a few years ago. But then ultimately the goal still remained. What about all the other harms, the privacy harms? And as we were thinking about it, we realized that, part of the problem is that there isn't a kind of one size fits all privacy harm. There actually are a lot of different types of harms that can arise from different types of privacy violations. So what we did was try to map out what those harms are. We created a typology of these harms and identified quite a lot of them, more than a dozen, that can arise. So that ultimately the goal is to provide a better understanding so that courts and legislatures and others who are trying to figure out the landscape here can identify and think through what those harms can be. It's really hard if you're not thinking about it and you don't really see a typology, you might not really be able to realize when there could be a potential harm. And we were inspired to do the article because the law has struggled a lot with recognizing privacy harm. This has been manifested in a number of cases losing on standing for various privacy violations. The Spokio case where a law was violated, and even though there was a right of action in the law, the Supreme Court said you don't have standing because we don't see a harm, or basically, actually, they kicked it back and for that, saying that courts can deny standing for lack of harm. Ultimately, the Ninth Circuit did find harm. But when the Supreme Court was actually trying to figure out, what a harm was, they really didn't understand privacy. They didn't understand what could be done with data, and it really showed in the opinion, their ignorance of how folks could be harmed from certain violations. And so this is something I think courts struggle with, legislators struggle with, really understanding what it is, because I think that it is the right move to base privacy law and invoke privacy law on harms. That's where we want the law to be. Otherwise, the law becomes an exercise in excessive formalism. And there are certain aspects of the GDPR that I think are very formalistic I like the GDPR a lot. I think it's a great law. I think it's wonderful. But there are parts that are very formalistic that it's not clear it's really helping the consumer, or really, I think it even is more detrimental, like all these stupid cookie notices that pop up all the time that I think is actually ultimately worse, but rather than better. But
let me give you my favorite example. There was a fine against PwC in Italy. They needed employee data, not for anything unusual. It was, benefits, payments, stuff that employees obviously, wanted. And they asked the employees' consent. And they got hit with a clobbering fine because, of course, every data protection expert, but not every reasonable human being, knows that you don't ask employees' consent. They don't have the ability to really consent for something like that. So obviously, they just should have done it as part of the contract. There was no issue that they shouldn't have used the employees' information to pay them and do what they needed to do. But formalistically, in this instance, they actually asked consent and they paid a whopping fine. So I'm kind of like, I get the point. You can't make employees agree to stuff that's bad for them and just say they got consent. But this was so formalistic that made my head explode.
Yeah, and that's the problem is a formalism without looking at, well, what is actually harmful? What is harming the consumer, and how do we protect the consumer? So I think that I like the instinct to look for harms, and that's what the U.S. law typically has done. However, the problem is that with a poor, narrow, crabbed understanding of harm, a lot of harms haven't been redressed. That what we've seen is a kind of a different formalism or whatever, where it's almost a game of gotcha, weird reasons for throwing out cases or not recognizing harm, or laws that recognize certain types of things as bad and then other things are fine, that are kind of left untouched. The California law, for example, now the California Privacy Rights Act. There's certain things that are seen as like the worst things in the world in that law, and then other aspects of privacy the law doesn't even touch that are very problematic, and seems to start from like a recognition of at least a few types of privacy harms, but there's a lot of others that are just left unaddressed in this law. So not really a kind of a comprehensive way to protect people's privacy, as I often it's so comprehensive. It's not. It targets certain things, but it misses other things. And I think that it's important, to really look at the harms and address all of the harms, so that the law is really getting at what it should get at, but it often doesn't, even in a harms-based system like ours, where there are a lot of gaps and a lot of these harms are unaddressed and unremedied. And hopefully the article will help provide the kind of philosophical, theoretical background, so that people's understanding of this, and they're seeing things, they see more, and that might help recognize why some of these laws are too narrow, or why they aren't getting at what they should get at, or courts that are, I think, too quick to dismiss a case because they're looking for harm in only one dimension and really not seeing the other dimensions.
Dan, how would you differentiate this from your famous Understanding Privacy book, where you defined privacy, but in many ways you showed all of the harms that might be contemplated? How is this different? Obviously, you're tying it a bit more to when there's direct legal reaction, but did you follow the same sort of framing? How did these two books, this book and that paper, fit together?
Yeah, it's a great question, because in that book I did do a taxonomy of privacy. I looked at all sorts of different types of things that I call problems, and I called them problems because they're not necessarily inherently harmful. So the lens there, it's related, because they can cause problems. They can be problematic. They can create certain types of what I call disruption, or things that could ultimately lead to problems, but they weren't necessarily harmful in and of themselves. They were just things that we should be concerned about, like the aggregation of information about somebody. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to harm somebody or create a harm, but it certainly could. It creates a big risk. And in the harms piece, the focus was a lot more on what actually causes harm to someone. When is the harm manifested? So there's overlap there, but they are kind of getting at different things. The one in Understanding Privacy is getting at definitional issues. How do we identify when there's a privacy situation and when there is an activity going on that we should be looking at and focusing on and possibly regulating, because it could be threatening to privacy. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's harmful. It just means that we need to look at it. Then the next step is, well, when it's harmful, when it's actually causing a harm, that's sort of when we want to invoke the law in there and start to stop it, and prohibit it, or restrict it, or minimize the harm. That's sort of more of a different kind of legal intervention.
So making data public would be a harm, but it also could be, in another case, an important transparency in revealing, information that society should reveal, and the harm angle at it. Awesome. Well, I got to tell you, I skimmed it. I got a good feel for it, but I'm printing it out now for my Saturday slower, detailed reading, and I encourage folks who haven't a chance to read this important paper to do so. Before I let you go, this past week was one of your big annual conferences. What do you next have coming up that people who want to participate in one of the notable events, the Privacy Law Scholars program? I'm looking forward. That's already locked up and focused on bringing a lot of the leading academic work. That's my other reading for the weekend, to make sure I catch up on some of the key papers. But you've got some privacy salons. You have a number of other events. Anything people should know about or check out on your site that might be coming up?
Yeah, well, we just finished a big event, the Privacy and Security Forum. We've been having this event now for about 7-8 years. It's an event I co-organize with Professor Paul Schwartz at Berkeley. And this time we did a all virtual event. We had 1,300 participants, so it's a record turnout. We have one in the spring and one in the fall. So we are going to have one coming up in the very end of September, early October. Dates are on the website. It's the website is Privacy Security Academy.com. And you can, or you just do a search on Privacy and Security Forum, and you'll pull up the event. So this fall, we're going to start gearing up for the fall event, start asking for speakers and start the process again. It's very much like Sisyphus. We push the rock up the hill, the event happens, and then the rock is all the way back down on the hill, and we start all over again, pushing it back up the hill. So we are going to start planning for the October event, which will be virtual. Hopefully the next one in next May will be in person. So that is our hope. But the fall one will be virtual, and the benefit of the virtual is we can bring more people. We get record attendance with the virtual, which is nice. A lot of folks that can't go in person can go online. So that is the one silver lining about all this. But I think the event went really well. We're excited about the fall event. There's an endless supply of topics to talk about in this field, and we're never wanting for something to discuss.
Folks, the Eyemonger, please check it out, by Professor Daniel Solove, illustrated by Ryan Beckwith, and it is really actually beautifully illustrated. I enjoyed it, and your children will, and you want it on your shelf if you work in privacy and data protection. Dan, thanks for catching up with me. Hope you've got a good long Memorial Day weekend planned, and look forward to now that things are reopening a little bit. We're still doing our events virtual as well, but people are starting to have coffee and do other small things. So hopefully we'll cross paths in person before too long. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Great. Jackson, thanks for your help. Bye, everybody.